What is the scariest / creepiest thing you have seen / heard? Part 2. One of the scariest things I ever heard was when I worked in retail. My store used to do layaway, and that was where I worked. Right by the layaway counter, we had 3 bathrooms. A men's multi-stall, a women's multi-stall, and a family bathroom. Well, only the family bathroom had a door that locked, all the others had the push/pull swing door. I was in the back cleaning up, and I thought I hear screaming, so I walked out front by the counter. I heard more screaming. I was not sure at first where it was coming from. I ran and checked the men's and women's bathroom, and they were empty, and I still heard the crying and screaming. It was coming from the family bathroom. I banged on the door, but the yelling, screaming, crying kept going on. It sounded like a child, and I had no idea what was going on. I called for a manager, because I had no way of getting in the door, since it was locked. This whole time there is still crying, screaming, banging. After several attempts of trying to open the door, we called 911. We had no idea what was going on, but it didn't sound good. I think about 15 minutes at this point, although it felt forever. Then the sound check stopped. No more banging, crying, nothing. We banged on the door until the police came. When they finally did, they had to kick the door in since we had no key. As we all stood around and looked in, all we saw was blood all over the place. We were not really sure what happened at first, but the police told us to back up, and that is when they pulled out a lady and a child. A bloody child, maybe 3. We all just stood there in shock. The child was not moving. We thought he was dead, because of all the blood. They took the lady away, in handcuffs, and the child to the hospital. We all had to give statements. Later my manager told me what happened. They just snapped. He wouldn't stop crying, and she just had enough, and did whatever she could to make him stop. He did live. I was sure he was dead, but he wasn't. She had just knocked him out, from hitting him so hard. This story is not scary, in the ghost sense, but for that to happen right behind the door and not know what is going on or be able to help, was pretty scary to me. I was buying a house last year, and one of the places I decided to look at was a renovated farmhouse. The main building itself was pretty nice, and I was considering it as an option, but then the realtor took me to check out the old barn that was on the property. From the outside, it looked like it could be converted into a really nice workshop. I walked inside and almost immediately felt something fall on my head. I brushed it away, and did the "get it off me" dance until it fell to the ground. It was a tiny spider. Then another drop on my head. I repeated my freak out and got another, larger spider out of my hair. Then I made the mistake of looking up. There was a huge black spot on the wall, which I realized after my eyes focused, was the biggest effing cluster of spiders I have ever seen in my life. In that moment, I was a faster sprinter than Usain Bolt. My parents bought their first house back in 1972. It was a fixer-upper, but they decided to move in right away and fix things, as time/money permitted. Within a few days of moving in, the new neighbors came over to introduce themselves. They also let my parents know that the previous owners had moved out after a nasty divorce. They had lost their second baby, from SIDS, and their relationship went downhill from there. My parents were horrified, more so, because they were newly pregnant, and couldn't imagine going through such a thing. They eventually pretty much forgot all about it. Life went on. They were in love with their new life and their new house. In preparation for the baby, they decided to wallpaper the nursery. Now, my dad told my mom there was no need in wallpapering the inside of the closet, but she insisted. She was kneeling down, scraping off old paint, inside of the closet, when her eyes fell upon something that made her blood turn to ice. Written in crayon, at about eye level for a kindergartner, in childish scrawl was, "I killed the baby." I was playing around with a radio once, when I was a kid, just slowly spanning through the static, trying to find a station. I had found an old television antenna, attached it to the side of our house and ran a wire out my window to it, with an alligator clip attached to the radio antenna, allowing me to get a way broader range of signals. So I'm sitting there, early in the morning, like 2 a.m., slowly sweeping frequencies, and suddenly I get to this station that's playing this very weird crackling sound. It sounded sort of like cracking knuckles, or maybe Rice Krispies cereal, but with a fixed, rhythmic pattern, instead of being random. I sat there listening to it for a second, then it suddenly stopped and this faint voice says, "It doesn't work. We're already dead. We're already dead." It took a second for the weight of the words to hit me, but when they did, I freaked the F out, and almost threw the radio across the room. I'm pretty sure it was just someone messing around with a radio transmitter. But damn if it didn't scare the shit out of me at the time. Years ago, I lived in a townhouse above an old couple, that were the landlords. This was in the historic section of Albany, New York near the park. The landlords were in their 60s, maybe early 70s. This place actually had a plaque on the front of it saying, it was built in 1880 something, and that some rich state senator had lived there. There's places like this all over the area that had been subdivided and rented out. I lived there for a year, and every now and then, always while I was trying to sleep, I would hear faint organ music accompanied by some rhythmic banging sounds. I always have slept with a fan, to drown out any ambient noise, and sleep better. This music was just floating through my room. No one was above me. Just the old people, who went to bed at 9 below me. I would get up, and try to find the source of the sounds, but it just seemed like it was everywhere and nowhere. Since I never heard any music or anything from any other room, and I never heard that music during the day, I concluded that it was the ghosts of previous occupants, that had lived there decades before. This actually affected my decision to live there again, when my lease was up. The old couple even offered to knock $50 a month off the rent, if I resigned. That would have amounted to nearly a month of total rent over the course of a year. I thanked them, but declined, opting instead to live in a newer place. Flash forward a couple of years. My friend is having a party. He invites some co-workers that he used to work with at the state. I'm talking to one dude about all the places in Albany I had been in. He's lived in several, too. After some conversation, we find out that one of his friends used to live in that exact same apartment before me. I've never told anyone about the music and banging I would hear there, but I just have to ask this guy if his friend ever said anything about the place being haunted. His eyes light up when I asked him. "You're not going to believe this," he says, and starts thumbing through the contacts list in his phone. He dials his friend. When the guy answers, he gives him a brief overview of the conversation we had been having, then hands me the phone. "What's up, man? Yeah, I lived there in 2003. You heard the music, too? That was the landlords having sex below you. I swear to God. I actually asked about them about it, the morning after I had heard it for the 10th time." The old man sheepishly explained that he was banging his old lady. He apologized and said they'd keep it down. The funny thing is, it seemed to get louder and louder over the last couple months I lived there. It was almost like they wanted me to hear. The mystery was solved. That organ music I had heard was literally organ music that the old people would have sex to. Somehow, that was creepier than it being ghosts. Since this is going to get buried, this one is for you, guy who hits new. In the middle of the summer, 2 summers ago, I was sleeping in my bed peacefully when I heard the loudest thunder I've ever heard in my life. Normally I am not afraid of thunder, but this time my entire house shook as if it was a huge earthquake. I shake it off and go back to sleep. No big deal. Next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a flash of bright purple lightning and the loudest effing thunder that Zeus could possibly create. Then I start to hear the screams. It had seemed as if outside my window was a choir of demented hellspawn, screeching in cries of agony. As I laid in bed terrified, I thought to myself, this is actually happening. I can hear them. This is how it ends. Later I found out that the screams were just a pack of foxes that were scared by the intense lightning, but still that was some scary shit right there. Dr. Thor tries to smite some demon foxes and they eat me. Growing up I lived in the middle of the woods. No neighbors for about a mile on each side, and we owned 60 acres of forest then a swamp after that. So basically I lived in the middle of nowhere. One summer when I was about 14, I was out in the middle of the woods playing with my dog. I'm an only child and both of my parents were out of town, when I kept feeling something hit my elbow. I'd go to throw Max's ball and the bump would make me throw it, almost straight up. Assuming it was just me bumping it on trees or something, I ignored it. After the 4th or 5th time of it happening I thought, well this sucks, I'll just go home. Walking back I felt uneasy but I knew I was just freaking myself out, because we were alone. About an hour later, Max and I are at home on the couch when the garage door opens and he starts barking. I hop up to go let in my mom or dad, even though they were home really early. I peered through the peephole and saw the door was still shut and no one was in the garage. Quieting Max down I opened the door slowly and called out for my dad. Nothing. No response at all, so I go out to check the door and it's still locked. Okay. Sure. Weird but oh well. Max heard it too, so at least I know I'm not crazy. About 20 minutes later, I hear the door open again and this time Max starts growling like crazy. I quiet him down again and just assume it's the wind or something making noise, even though by this point my heart is racing. I hear footsteps come up the stairs and think, oh geez, Dad really is home this time, and hop up and run to the door. It starts to jiggle, so I run faster to let him in. I peep through the hole, and even though my hand is loosely around the jiggling handle, there's no one on the other side of the door. Terrified, I go hide on the couch with all the lights on. Max is still growling. About an hour after that, I start to feel a little better, even though I'm still terrified. Then I hear the door handle jiggle again. This time it was Max jiggling it. He needed to go outside, and the only way outside is through the garage. Fantastic. I literally sprint with him to the kennel, and as I'm standing in there, I decide to ask this thing questions to make myself feel better, because I knew it wouldn't answer me. Thinking about what to ask it, my eyes are drawn to the huge heavy oak door on the kennel. It was always open, because it was too heavy for me to move easily. I said, okay ghost. If you're real, you'll shut this heavy door. Nothing. A minute goes by, nothing. Max is still sniffing around. I turn around to yell at him to hurry up, and then from behind me I hear, click. I whipped around, and saw the giant door had swung shut and latched. Okay, clearly it was just the wind. It wasn't really windy, but it was the wind, for sure, had to be. I proceed, okay ghost, that was the wind. If you're really real, you'll open this massive door back up. Nothing. I relax a bit and then squat down with my head in on my knees, reminiscing about how lame I just was being scared, when I hear, click clack. The door was now wide open. Max was done, so we booked it back into the house, locking every door in the house. For the next 4 hours I would hear the footsteps on the stairs and the door handle jiggling every few minutes, until finally around 11 p.m. my dad walks in, and yells at me for wasting electricity. I never told him or my mom about it, until about 4 months later, when my dad came in from hunting after dark. He looked shaken, and I asked him what was wrong. He said, he aimed at 2 deer but missed both completely, because it felt as if something was hitting his elbow and making him shoot way above the deer. That's when I told him everything. So I'm from small country in Central Europe. Loads of people have probably never heard of it. It combines small patch of Adriatic Sea and Alps, but landscape is mostly small green hills, each with a little church on top. Almost 2/3 of land is covered with forests, and capital is famous for its Middle Age architecture. It is an adorable country in which most of the time nothing really happens. Like most of the population, I live in the countryside, few hundred meters apart from closest neighbor, right next to the forest. I spent most of my childhood in that forest. I can still remember which the best trees for climbing were, and where certain flowers grew. But the thing I will never forget happened in the summer of 2001. I was just around 12 back then, and I was spending my whole afternoons in the forest. Most of the times, I was roaming around, with my best friend, but that day I was alone. As I said before, most of the land around here isn't flat. The hill behind our house is quite steep. Right above our house is old orchard my great-granddad planted, and when you come on the top of the hill you can almost see the capital city in the distance. Then there is big forest, that extends across the karst landscape practically right to the Italian border, with a few smaller towns and villages in between. I never really went very far, because I mostly stayed in the area my family owned, but that day I decided I want to see some more. I didn't have much with me, and I didn't tell my parents I was going anywhere far. I always felt very safe, in the woods, even though bears were often seen in the area. In reality, the most dangerous thing you can bump into are drunken hunters. Forest is pretty in the summer, leaves and tall trunks made me feel like I'm in a big cathedral. I started to sing a tune I have heard on the radio some time ago. At that point I was about 1.5 hours walking distance away from home. I decided to stray away from the main road that leads through the forest in big curves and to take the shortcut. Sun was setting and light was making leaves glowing in sharp colors. But soon all the light disappeared, and I find myself wandering in the twilight on territory unknown to me. Wind was blowing, and dry branches were making weird noises. I started to feel uncomfortable. And in one sheer moment I discovered I am lost. I could feel the panic in form of adrenaline that started to flow through my veins. My instincts were screaming to run away, but I forced myself to focus and tried to get orientation. It was all pointless. I had no idea where I was. I started to walk around aimlessly, hoping to at least find the road. Suddenly I saw a small figure standing far off in the distance. From what I saw, it could only be a small child, with a long slender neck, scaly but smooth skin and deep red eyes. I started walking towards it, but the figure noticed me and ran away. I chased figure in forest for quite a long time. I never came enough close to actually distinguish any of its features, but it looked like a small girl, no older than I was at the time. In one moment I was running, and in the next the floor under me disappeared. I felt that dreadful feeling of falling, similar to one in very bad nightmare when everything feels like slow motion. Then that awful sound of body hitting the floor. A moment later, also came the pain. For a moment I motionless lied on the ground. Finally I pulled myself together and opened my eyes, waiting for them to adjust the thick darkness in the cave, where I landed. First everything was pitch blackness. And then I saw. There was a single pair of eyes staring at me, for less than a few inches in front of my face. I quickly backed away, until I hit something dry and crumbly. Somewhere in the back, fires were lit. First there was one, and then more and more, until chamber was fully lit. There were thousands and thousands of eyes watching me. Dead eyes in dry sockets, skin that was stretched over the bones, mouths hanging open, like in big shock, but that was only because lips rot in the time that passed. I stared. I wasn't able to move or scream. I am not even sure I was able to breath. I blinked, hoping for dreadful image in front of me to disappear. As I opened my eyes, all otherwise motionless corpses moved. In the matter of fact, I didn't really see them move, but when I blinked it was like everything got one step closer. I felt cold sweat slipping down my neck, and my eyes began to water. I could help myself. I blinked again. This time, I was completely surrounded. I simply closed my eyes, wishing for all to be just a bad dream. I didn't hear a single sound. I smiled thinking that soon I will wake up. When I opened my eyes, there was a face, almost touching my face. I could clearly see dried and rotten face, eyes filled with numbness. I started to feel dizzy. I felt something like dust and bones grabbing my hair and tearing my clothes. I felt it and I didn't feel it, because I became so damn dizzy and sick. I tried so hard to stay conscious, to fight, but I couldn't move a single muscle. And then it was again pitch blackness all around me. I opened my eyes, trying to adjust to the lack of light. I was lying on the forest ground, not so far away from home. In that exact moment all my body started to function normally. I ran home like a wind. I had no idea how I got there, and I just tried to forget about whole thing, but my peace didn't last very long. Next night I dreamed about people I saw back there. I woke up to the face looking at me from the window. It was the face of a little girl. She was also dead, and her empty eyes watched me with wild anger, as she was clawing the window, trying to get in. I am having the same nightmare for the past 12 years. At that time, I visited many different therapists. They say it is just stress from school and job, that I should try to relax. But how can I relax, when every night as I open my eyes, a girl is one step closer to me? One night she finally got close enough to mutter just one sentence to me, "I'm in need about tree fitty." It was at that moment that I realized, this creepy female figure off in the distance, was 500 feet tall and from the Paleolithic era. DL, drive, some scary shit happens when you witness a genocide. Well, I'll never forget this one. My wife and I used to live in a townhome that backed to some woods. We both took off work one day to get some things done in the yard, cutting the grass, weeding our large flower beds, laying mulch, etc. Our yard wasn't big. It took about 2 full grass clipping bags. I would walk a couple of feet into the woods and dump them in a pile. As I'm walking back to empty the second bag, something in the middle of the woods catches my eye. Something out of place and it's moving. I crouched down, to get a better look and I just froze. At first, I could make out a pair of shoes just swaying back and forth, and then was able to see the legs and body of a teenager. There in the middle of the woods, was a teenage boy who had hung himself. Next to the tree, I could see a skateboard leaning up against it. I yelled for my wife to call the police, and started running back, to try and save him but he was gone. His body was limp and his head was just slumped over. His dark scruffy hair was slowly blowing in the breeze. The cops came and quickly cut him down and they were gone. As it turns out, he was having problems getting along with his parents and this is what he decided to do. I never seemed to have much luck with commenting and the like, but, nonetheless, up until I was about 8 or so, I lived in a really old house that, since the beginning of time, had been bounced around from relative to relative, until eventually my mother had been handed over the keys. It was basically a shit heap. 2 stories, a collapsed balcony on the second level, mold and mildew all over most of the ceilings, 1 tiny bathroom, and the toilet was outside, overrun with frogs and spiders and whatever other kind of hellspawn the Australian outback would throw at us. I was terrified as a child, scared of basically everything. I'm much better now, and have much bigger balls than most of my friends, if I do say so myself. Nonetheless, I would probably have to put the blame on this old house of mine. I remember as a child that I would always have the same dream. I'd start in the kitchen, no idea how I got there, of course. It was during the day, probably later in the afternoon. Nobody was around, so naturally I'd go looking for my mother and father. I'd go to all the normal places. Mom wasn't in the laundry shed or the lounge room, Dad wasn't on the patio outside or up the back at the chicken coop, and my sister wasn't around either. I was starting to get worried, thinking that everyone was gone and they'd left me alone. Until I heard a noise, above me, coming from the second floor, where the bedrooms are. Relieved, I darted towards the stairs and jumped on the first step. Then I felt it. There was something in the back of my head, making me stop, legs still raised up, as I prepared to move on to the second step. Something telling me that I shouldn't go up there. Of course this thought was running rampant in my mind, don't go up there, don't go up there, stay down here, don't go up there, there's something up there. Finally my leg dropped before I could reconsider. I pushed myself up those stairs, and even though I didn't want to anymore, I couldn't stop myself, only slow down. Each step up was taken at an agonizingly slow pace, and I wanted so bad just to go back downstairs and find someone, run to my grandparents' house and stay with them until my mom was home. But eventually, I rounded the corner, leaving only the last few steps leading up to the floor ahead of me. There was nothing there, I couldn't see anything in the stairwell. I started getting hopeful at this point, maybe it's okay. Nobody's here. I was just imagining things and it's going to be fine. I'm still taking the slow steps up, when it appears, something's there. I can't actually remember what it was, and I never could, after I woke up. But it was horrifying beyond belief, and I would always try to close my eyes, because that was my thing as a child, if you can't see it, then it can't see you. But I could still see it. I couldn't blink, I couldn't shut my eyes, it was like my eyelids weren't working. I would even try holding my hands in front of my face, but still I couldn't block it out, I could see through my hands. And I couldn't do anything, I was frozen, unable to do anything, except stare at this thing, all but a meter away from me. Whatever I saw, whatever I did, for those 8 years I was at that house, I had to force myself up the stairs. Day or night, it was horrifying. My mother sighed and tried to reason with me, my father growled at me and called me a coward, and my sister just laughed, and said I was retarded. But every time I had to go up those stairs, as soon as I hit the top stairwell, I had to stop and make sure that I could cover my eyes with my hands or that I could shut my eyes. Of course it would terrify me most, when I'd go to blink and wave my hand in front of my face, and it wouldn't work and I'd realize I was dreaming. Edit, oh wow, comments and upvotes, my word what a wonderful day. Thought it might be interesting to add, that once I moved out of this house, I never had any more of those dreams, though I was terrified of my house in general. I couldn't be alone in it, until I was about 15, and every morning before school, I'd basically run out of the house from my room, and wouldn't feel safe, until I was out the door and on the front lawn. I worked at 2 hospitals, placement, during my last year of college. At one hospital I worked with professionals that did therapeutic play with children on the pediatric ward, as well as on the adolescent psych ward. At the other hospital, my boss and I would do crafts, projects, art, etc. with the teens, to help them have an outlet, while they were getting treatment for mental illness, addiction issues and other medical issues. Each day, before we would see the teens, we would get a rundown from the nurses on the ward explaining who everyone was, what issues they were being hospitalized for, and any other info we needed. This could include anything from a warning that the patient had violent tendencies, how they are adjusting to being on the ward, which patients they did or did not get along with, etc. So this one night, we were given the usual rundown of the teens on the ward, and the nurse mentioned one teen in particular. This girl, I will call her Sally, obviously not her real name, had all of a sudden just stopped talking one day, and started to act really out of character. She would not respond to family, friends, siblings, doctors or anyone for that matter. She was hospitalized, because they became concerned about her harming herself, and they were definitely trying to ensure she was being watched 24/7, just in case she was experiencing some type of psychosis. I don't know a ton of details, because we were just given a quick rundown of the patient's case. From what I was told, they had checked and ruled out a brain tumor and other possible physiological causes and found nothing abnormal. Now just to set the stage, this hospital is a very old hospital with dark hallways, poorly lit rooms, and the coldest most creepy atmosphere I have ever experienced. In every way it looked like a hospital you would see in a horror movie, and when walking down the hallways, I remember always being scared something would jump out at me, because there were a lot of blind spots, due to its very old layout. Anyways, this night in particular my co-worker/boss and I started the crafts and activities for the kids in the kitchen room where we always did our activities. I was sitting close to Sally and tried to initiate conversations, but she would just stare blankly. My boss/co-worker tried as well, and Sally would not respond, and without warning, she would just occasionally look at us and laugh loudly or smile at me with glossy eyes. The doctors had tried all day to get her to speak and she said nothing, so I just chatted and tried my best to include her, even though she wouldn't really engage. I started to doodle on a piece of paper while talking with some of the teens, and just randomly wrote down, "Hi," and drew around it, not even really thinking about what I was doing. Almost immediately after I wrote, "Hi," Sally picked up a pencil and wrote, "Hello." I was shocked to say the least. I was the first person in days and days that she attempted to communicate with. I didn't know if it would work, but I wrote, "How are you?" And she actually wrote an answer. I was blown away. After Sally and I exchanged a couple questions/answers, my coworker noticed what was going on, so she kept the other teens busy and just nodded at me to keep going. Within a few minutes, this girl and I had written almost a page of conversation and she was communicating through writing with no trouble. I couldn't believe it was happening. I was getting all this info from a girl that everyone thought was unreachable. We talked through writing for what seemed like hours, but was probably just about 1 hour, and while I was asking her about how she was feeling about being in the ward, she admitted through writing that she was scared. I pressed on, trying to see if she was scared because she was in a strange place or missed her family, etc., but she wrote it was because she saw people in the room with us. Obviously, there were people in the room with us, so I asked her why the people in the room scared her and she simply wrote, "They are dead." I swear, when I read, it felt like my stomach hit the floor. I looked up from the page we were writing on, and she just looked at me and then turned her head and stared at the door. No one was there. Well, at least, I didn't see anyone there. Sally stared at that door for easily a minute, and I swear she saw something there. I was more scared than I could even express. I will never forget the look on her face. Whether or not there was a person/ghost there, Sally could see someone. I took some deep breaths, and once I had her attention again, we started communicating again through writing. We talked this way until 9 p.m. when I had to leave with my co-worker/boss. I thanked Sally for speaking to E, and she seemed a lot more aware when I said goodbye. She still was not verbalizing, but I know that the doctors were going to do their best to find out why. I collected the papers we had written on, and before leaving the ward showed the entire conversation to my co-worker and the nurse in charge. Everyone on duty, nurses, etc., was dumbfounded that I had actually communicated with her, and they assured me that the pages would be passed along to the psychiatrist the next morning. I was filled with so many emotions. I was happy I had spoken to her and she was honest with me, but I was also still incredibly scared and shaken up. My co-worker dropped me off at home, and I remember walking into the living room and my roommates knew immediately something had happened. They were supportive, but also freaked out by the situation. I have never been happier to have roommates, because if I had gone home to an empty place, I probably wouldn't have slept for days. Sadly, because of the schedule I had, and the many different shift changes at the hospital, I never saw Sally again and no one knew what the final diagnosis was for her. I still get chills when I think about the look on her face that night, when she stared at the door. I don't think I will ever shake that feeling. I just hope she got the help she needed. Edit, spacing, word/spelling fixes. TLDR, worked on an adolescent psych ward, in a hospital that could be the set for a horror movie, and got a girl who wouldn't talk to communicate through writing. During the conversation, she divulged she could see dead people in the room with us, and stared at one of them that was standing in the doorway. I gave her the papers from our conversation to the medical staff, who couldn't believe she actually spoke. My old coworker had a son that was in his mid-30s and he had a son named Hunter, that was 4 or 5. She said that Hunter would have bad dreams, and that he would sleep with his dad when he got scared. One night his dad woke up, because he heard Hunter calling him. But he was calling him by his name, not Dad. So he went to his room and he was asleep. He woke him up and said, "Hunter, you were calling me. Is everything okay?" And Hunter said, "Dad, when they call you you're not supposed to answer," and fell back asleep. He asked him about it in the morning, but he said he didn't remember saying it. I get chills when I think about it. One morning at about 1 a.m., I got a phone call from my little sister's cell. She lived a time zone to the east, so it was 2 a.m. there. It woke me up, and I immediately sensed that something was wrong. I picked up the phone and groggily said, "Hello?" when I heard a muffled woman's voice, possibly my sister's, say, "Please, help me." She sounded terrified and desperate. I immediately thought I was having a taken moment. My sister is being kidnapped/tortured, and it was all she could do to call me for help. Should I hang up and dial 911? Should I yell into the phone? Should I keep listening and try to pick up some kind of relevant information? I really wished I had one of those fancy phone recording devices that the taken guy had right then. I opted to keep listening, and as I did, I occasionally heard muffled yelling and screaming, much to my horror. Her phone must have been hidden away pretty well. Then something strange happened. I heard what was clearly my sister's voice, also muffled, but completely calm. I didn't hear what she said, but it was a very casual, conversational tone. Then I noticed for the first time that there was also scary music along with the yelling and stuff in the background. DL, drive, my sister butt dialed me, in the middle of a goddamn horror flick, at 2 in the morning. I hung up, called back, and gave her hell for it.